Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery. This one isn't a really obscure case. It's one that you've probably heard of, but as you're currently watching this, I'm on holiday, so I'm pre-filming all my videos, and I just wanted to talk about a case this week that I already knew and understood really well because I didn't have time to research a brand new case from scratch. And this is a case that I've been reading about and learning about for quite a long time. This week we're talking about the case of the Sodder children, which is often called one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. So our story starts with George and Jenny Sodder, who met in the early 1900s in West Virginia. Both George and Jenny were Italian immigrants who had moved from Italy to the USA in their early childhood, so they didn't know each other back in Italy, and they just happened to meet one day. They married and they settled down in a house in Fayetteville in West Virginia. Fayetteville was quite a small town with a very large population of immigrants, mostly Italian immigrants. And George and Jenny were pretty well off. They did very, very well for themselves, and they lived in a very nice house, one of maybe the nicest in town. It was a two-storey timber frame house, and they were really proud of this house. It was a visual representation of the American dream to them. They'd for it, and now they had this amazing house. Their first child, a son, was born in 1923, and over the next 20 years they'd go on to have 9 more children, leaving them with a total of 10, and they were a very happy family. In age order, the children were John, who was born in 1923, Joe, who was born shortly after. By the time the story I'm about to tell you about today happened, Joe had actually moved out of the family house and he was now in the army, so you probably won't hear any mention of Joe. Marion, George Jr., Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty, and the youngest was 2-year-old Sylvia. Marion had been working all day that day, and she arrived home with some presents for her youngest siblings, 3 of her little sisters, and she'd bought these presents, little toys, with the wages she'd earned that day, and the girls were so excited by this that they begged their parents to let them stay up later, even though by this point it was already 10 p.m. Jenny said that they could stay up later as long as Maurice and Louis remembered to do their chores that night, and their regular chores were to bring the cows in and to feed the chickens before going to bed themselves. George Sr., John and George were already asleep in their downstairs bedrooms, and shortly after this Jenny decides to go to bed as well, taking 2-year-old Sylvia with her. She leaves the children all playing very, very happy in the front lounge. About 12:30 a.m. the phone rings and Jenny wakes up. She goes to answer it, and on the other end of the phone is a woman, and this woman asks somebody whose name that Jenny doesn't recognise, and so Jenny tells her that she probably has the wrong number. Jenny said that she vividly remembered the sound of glasses clinking in the background, people were laughing, and the woman in particular had a very, very weird laugh. By the time she didn't really think anything of it, just hung the phone back up and went to bed. On her way back to bed though, she notices that the lights in the front room are still on and the curtains hadn't been drawn, which was something the children would usually do before they went to bed. If they were the last ones going to bed, they'd shut the curtains and turn the light off. But the children were nowhere to be seen, so Jenny just assumes that they'd forgotten. She notices that Marion is asleep on the sofa and assumes that all the rest of the children have gone upstairs to their bedrooms. I think it was 2 separate bedrooms upstairs on like different sides of the house. Jenny, George and the oldest children all slept in downstairs bedrooms along with Sylvia. So Jenny goes back to sleep before being woken up again about half an hour later to the sound of an object hitting the roof with a very loud bang, and then she hears this kind of rolling noise. Jenny assumes that it's just an animal, and so she heads back to sleep again. Half an hour later though, she's woken up again, this time for the last time. She can smell smoke. She gets up to investigate and sees that George's office is on fire. She rushes back into the room to wake George up, and then he goes and wakes up the oldest boys. Jenny and George frantically shout to the children upstairs, but they get no response. You can't hear them moving around at all. And they can't head upstairs to go grab them themselves because by this time the staircase is already on fire. And bear in mind this is a timber frame house. This is going to go up in flames very, very quickly. Eventually the smoke is getting so thick that they have to get out of the house. So Jenny and George ran outside alongside 4 of their children, John, George Jr., Marion and Sylvia. Once they're outside though, George tries to re-enter the house to get to the children, but the staircase by this time is completely engulfed in flames. There's literally no way he can get upstairs. The smoke is so thick he can barely see anything, so he runs back outside and he decides to try and reach them through the upstairs window. He always kept a ladder propped up on the side of the house, and he goes around to grab this ladder and it's not there. Desperate now, he runs to grab one of his coal trucks. He plans to drive up to the house, climb on top of the truck, smash the window and climb inside. Both of his coal trucks were working perfectly the day before, but when George and his two sons run up to them to get them to work, neither of them will turn on. He tries to go and get some water to put the flames out himself, but it's obviously December, all the water is completely frozen over. So they have no choice but to just stand there and watch their house go up in flames with 5 children inside. Whilst George is desperately trying to figure out how to save his children, Marion decides to run to a neighbour's house so they can contact the fire department. But there's no operator response. They can't get hold of anyone. Another neighbour sees a fire and decides to jump in their car and drives to the nearest tavern to call for help. But once again, they make the call and there's no operator response. It seems like fate was just working against the Sodder family at this point. One neighbour jumps in their car and drives into town just to awaken the fire chief, Chief F.J. Morris. And he basically initiates Fayetteville's version of an alarm response. So basically he calls one of his firemen, who then calls another, who calls another. And so before you know it, everyone, or pretty much everyone, is aware of what's going on. As you can guess though, this doesn't exactly happen quickly. The fire department was only 2.5 miles away from the Sodder house, but they don't arrive there until 8 AM, 7 hours after the fire began. And obviously after 7 hours, this timber framed house had been reduced to nothing but a pile of ash. The house didn't take long to burn to the ground. Apparently the fire raged for just 45 minutes after Jenny first woke up. The house collapses in on itself into the basement, and the basement was filled with coal. And this coal just generated so much heat that even though there wasn't so much a fire left to be put out after 7 hours, it was just still really hot, just these burning coals. Of course, it was assumed that the 5 children left inside the house were dead by this point. When the police searched the remains of the house, which by this point were just ashes and coal, they find no signs of human remains. There is a chance, of course, that in very intense heat the bones could have burnt. Like, this was a huge fire and then all the coals in the basement just sort of like exacerbated it. But even if the bones were to burn, which is in itself unlikely, the teeth would likely still be there. They didn't even find so much as a single tooth. But Fire Chief Morris tells the Sodders that the fire was hot enough to burn them up completely, that there were no remains left in the ashes, but their children were definitely dead. However, despite this, when Jenny sort of like sifted through the remains of her house in the days after the fire, she found whole kitchen appliances that had kept their shape. They were obviously burnt, but it was still obvious what they were. So how come this happened, but there was no sign of any bones? But it is worth noting that this was 1945 at the end of the day, and by today's standards, this would have been just a very cursory search for bones. It wouldn't have been the forensics that we have today. It did actually come out years later that apparently the fire department had found some bones and a heart at the scene, but for whatever reason made the decision not to tell the parents. When the family found out about this all these years later, they confronted the fire chief, who led them to the site where he'd buried this human heart. And so he basically digs up this box with this heart inside, and it's sent off testing, and they confirmed that the heart is actually just a cow liver, and that was kind of it. It basically came out that the fire chief hadn't found anything and then pretended to find something and placed it in this box in the hope that one day the Sodders would find out that it's there, and then they'd feel at peace that their children had died in the fire. It's so strange, I really can't tell you the thought process behind it. He said that he expected the parents to find it one day and then feel peace, but why not just tell them on the day of, like, yeah, we found remains, even if you didn't, if you want them to feel peace. A state police inspector attributed the fire to faulty wiring, and by the new year, which was obviously just 6 days later, the coroner's office had issued 5 death certificates, the cause of death for all 5 children being fire or suffocation. The faulty wiring diagnosis bothered George because the wiring in question was newly installed. He'd had it installed very recently for an electric stove that he'd bought, and it just seemed unlikely that this wiring that was declared safe when he first got it installed had then gone on to cause this fire. After just 4 days, George Sodder makes the decision to bulldoze 5 feet of dirt over the site where the house was. He has this intention to turn it into a memorial garden for his kids. He can't bear to look at this sort of just pit anymore. He wants it to become something. This is despite the police chief telling him to leave it alone so further investigations could be done. He just decides that he just has to get it done. So he fills in the hole where the house was. On the 2nd of January in 1946, a funeral was held for all 5 children, and Jenny and George didn't attend it. They were way too grief-stricken, although the rest of the children did go. But over the coming weeks, Jenny and George began to work through their grief, and they began to piece the puzzle of the fire together. The more they thought about things, the less things seemed to make sense. For example, a telephone repairman came to look at the scene and told the Sodders that it appeared that the telephone phone line had been cut, not burnt. It was just a clean cut, as if somebody had done it with a pair of scissors. Weirdly, a man was actually seen by neighbours that night stealing a block and tackle, which is basically something that is used to lift heavy weights, from the property, from the Sodder property, around the time that the fire started. The man was eventually identified by the authorities and he was swiftly arrested, and he admits to the theft, and he does admit to cutting the phone line as well. Apparently he said that he thought it was the power line he was cutting instead, but he denies having anything to do with the fire. I don't know who this man was. I don't know if he had any link whatsoever to the Sodders. I'm going to assume that he didn't, and no explanation has ever been given as to why he wanted to try and cut the power line in the first place. But Jenny has said that if the power line was cut that night, then there would have been absolutely no way that her and her surviving children would have been able to escape the property. The only saving grace for them was the fact that the electric was still working and that the lights sort of led them to the exit. George has said that he thinks it may have been this same man who tampered with his coal truck engine, but authorities have said that they believe that George and his son simply flooded the engines when they were so desperately trying to get them to start. George's coal trucks had never failed to start before, yet on that night they refused to start. At the time they kind of just put it down to the cold weather, but there's also the ladder that George always kept propped up at the side of the house. That was gone, and that was later found thrown down a ditch about 50 feet away from the house. But also, we've already talked about how the fire was supposedly caused by faulty wiring. If this fire was electrical, how come the lights were still working? How come the house's Christmas lights were still on as the fire burned? If it was an electrical fault, then surely all of the electrics in the house would have stopped working. A couple of months after the fire, Sylvia was playing in what would have been sort of like the back garden of the house when she finds a rubber object. It's military green in colour. It was hollow with a twist-off cap. And the Sodders take this strange object to the authorities, who actually identify this object as an incendiary or a napalm bomb called a pineapple. Could it have been this that Jenny heard falling onto the roof about half an hour before the fire started? As you obviously would do, Jenny started to have doubts about the outcome of the investigation. She refused to believe that there was absolutely no trace of her children left in the remains of the house. So she starts to do her own experiments. She places chicken and pork bones in her wood-burning stove and she burns them for hours at a time at very high heat. But each time after the fire eventually went out, the bones still remained. They were charred, they were blackened, sure, but they were still there. An employee at the local crematorium told her that bones remain even after bodies are burned for 2 hours at 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 1093 degrees Celsius. Later she reads a newspaper article about a nearby 3-story house that burnt to the ground, killing all 7 people inside. The skeletons of all 7 people were found in the remains. Jenny and George therefore become convinced that their children had not died in that house. And then came the reported sightings. One late night bus driver in the area recalled what he described as balls of fire being thrown onto the roof of the Sodder house around the time that the fire started. One woman who was apparently watching the fire from the side of the road said that she saw the children being driven past her in a car as she stood there. All 5 children were just peering out of the window of the car. A motel operator between Fayetteville and Charleston said that the morning after the fire, she served all 5 children breakfast. And then a Charleston hotel owner reported seeing the 4 youngest Sodder children in the company of some Italian adults in about the week, maybe 2 weeks after the fire. Apparently they arrived one night around midnight. And she said that when she attempted to speak to the children, the adults sort of like gave her some funny looks and just ushered the children away. The Sodders decide to write to the FBI director at the time, J. Edgar Hoover, asking him for help in their children's case. They write multiple times, but each time they get a responsibility of to investigate the case. The local state police said that they needed evidence of kidnap or murder before they could reactivate the files and look into it as such. The FBI, however, did say they would be happy to assist if the local authorities gave them permission to, but the Fayetteville Police Department declined their offer of help. In total, the Sodders spent about $15,000 of their own money, which is equivalent to over $200,000 in today's money, hiring private investigators to help look for their children. One of these private investigators was named Cece Tinsley, and he did find something interesting. A few months before the fire, a man had appeared at the Sodder home and had tried to sell George some family life insurance, and he became irate when George declined his offer. The salesman tells him, "Your goddamn house is going to go up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed. You are going to pay for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." George was indeed very outspoken of his strong dislike, hatred of the Italian dictator Mussolini, and he argued with many people in town about his point of view. As I mentioned earlier, Fayetteville had a very large Italian population, so there was a lot of thoughts about Italian politics flying about. And even though Mussolini had been executed by this point, George's opinion was still hugely controversial, and it led to many an argument with people in town. Tinsley just happened to find out that the man who threatened George just happened to be a member of the coroner's jury, the jury that deemed the deaths, the fire, as accidental. And around the same time of the salesman visit, there's also another visitor to the home, this time a man who was seeking work, and he tells George that the fuse boxes around the back of his house are going to cause a fire someday. And George was very confused by this because, like I said, he had this installed very recently and it was deemed completely safe. Also, a few months before the fire, George Jr. and John had spotted a car sitting outside the children's school. Apparently, the man inside was watching the youngest Sodder children, and as they walked down the road, this car kind of followed them. In 1949, the Sodders decided to start a new search at the scene of the fire, and they bring in a Washington DC pathologist named Oscar B. Hunter. This time the excavation was very thorough, and they uncovered several shards of vertebrae. They were sent off for testing and the results came back very strange. They were indeed human bones, and there were 4 lumbar vertebrae belonging to just one individual. They all belonged to the same person, and this person would have likely been a minimum age of 16, maximum of 22. The oldest missing Sodder child was just 14 years old, and these bones showed much greater skeletal maturity than you would expect for a 14-year-old boy. Because of this, it's very unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely, that these bones belong to a 14-year-old. The vertebrae showed no evidence whatsoever that had been exposed to fire at any point, and there were no other bones found in this very careful excavation. Seeing that the house only burned for reportedly less than an hour, you would expect to find full skeletons according to experts. In the end, the report actually concluded that these were not the bones of any of the missing Sodder children, that they were actually bones that happened to be in the soil that George used to cover the entire site. This report actually led to 2 separate hearings in Charleston, which basically led to the authorities turning around and telling the Sodders that their search was hopeless, and they officially declared the case closed. Jenny and George are furious about this, so they decide to take matters into their own hand, and they erect a billboard along Route 16. On this billboard, they're offering a $5,000 reward for any information that would bring this case to a close, and they soon increased this to a $10,000 reward. Shortly after this, they erected another one, and one of these billboards actually remained up from the early 1950s right up until Jenny Sodder's death in 1989. This billboard about the Sodder children sort of became a landmark in the area. George and Jenny would respond to every single tip they ever got about the possibility that their children are alive, or anybody who knew what happened to their children, and they searched the country just following up all of these potential tips. They travelled to a city the other side of the country just on a whim, and this went on for years, for the rest of their lives. They never gave up. In 1967, a woman from Houston writes to the family to say that Louis Sodder had apparently revealed his true identity to her after he got drunk at a bar. Apparently this Louis told her that him and Maurice were living in Texas together somewhere, but other than that she didn't really know much else. George and his now son-in-law travel to meet this woman, but she's unable to speak, or she refuses to speak to them. The police do actually track down the men that she was apparently referring to though, and they both deny being the missing sons. The Sodders also received another letter that year, which they believe to be the most credible piece of evidence that their children are still alive. Jenny receives a letter postmarked from Central City in Kentucky with no return address. Inside the envelope is a picture of a young man, and he's around 30 years old and he strongly resembles Louis. On the back was written, Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Lil Boys maybe, I'm not entirely sure what that last bit was supposed to say, A90135 or 35. So they hire another private detective convinced that this photo means something. They send him off to Central City in Kentucky, and the private detective goes off the grid and they never hear from him again. They add the photo to the billboard hoping that somebody would recognise this man, and George dies shortly after in 1969. As of 2015, Sylvia is the only Sodder child who's still alive. I couldn't actually find out any information if she's still alive to this day in 2019, and she strongly believes that her siblings left the house alive that night. She doesn't think they died in that fire. So let's just mention a couple of theories. So I've already mentioned the theory of the salesman who was mad at George for his remarks about Mussolini. Could he have been so angry about this that he plotted his revenge and set the house on fire? Possibly, but it doesn't explain the potential missing children. This very well could have been a case of arson. I do not believe that it was caused by faulty wiring whatsoever. I think somebody set the house on fire. Possibly somebody who was mad at George's remarks about Italian politics. It's something that gets people very, very angry, as we still see today all the time. So in my head, there's not really a question as to whether it was arson or not. I'm pretty sure it was arson. The question is, where are the children and why was there no trace of them? A lot of people bring up the Sicilian Mafia in connection to this case, and this is actually Sylvia's favourite theory. Basically, they theorise that the Mafia were trying to extort money out of George, and as far as I can find, he never confirmed this nor denied it anywhere. They think that somebody plotted this, and because George owed them money, or they were trying to extort money from George, they thought they could get money possibly by selling the children, but to get hold of the children they had to make the family think that the children were dead, so they set the house on fire. This would involve somebody having to sneak into the house whilst Jenny and George are both asleep, which is very risky. They would have had to have walked upstairs, woken up 5 children, the oldest of whom would have been 14 and probably would have kicked up a fuss, and then got them out of the house silently. It just doesn't really seem possible, but then again, none of this really seems possible. The children may have been taken back to Italy or just taken to a different city in America, and then for whatever reason they've never tried to contact their parents, maybe fearing that it would harm them in some way. If somebody had done this, stolen the children and set the house on fire, this would have taken months of planning. They would have had to ensure in every way possible that there was no way that George or Jenny could get upstairs to see that the children were missing, because then the entire plan would be null. I mean, it's just the little things like the ladder not being at the side of the house where it was always kept for years and years. The coal trucks not starting when usually they start with no problem whatsoever. The staircase at this point just happening to be one of the main things in the house that is on fire. This would have taken some serious planning. Or it was just a fire that night, maybe a freak fire, and the children did die in it. Maybe it did burn hot enough to destroy all of the bones. Maybe the vertebrae did belong to 14-year-old Maurice. But the question remains, what started this fire? I think we can all agree that it's unlikely to be an electrical fault, seeing as the electrics remained on. It's likely an arson, given the bomb found in the garden and the balls of fire seen by the bus driver driving past. Maybe George made his political opinion known to just the wrong person. Somebody who wanted him to suffer, someone who purposely ensured that there was no way that he could save his children. Maybe they just wanted to cause the Sodders pain. There are so many unanswered questions in this case, and I don't see any way that it could ever be solved now, so this is likely to go down in history as one that will literally never be able to be solved. And that's everything I have for you in today's video. Make sure you give this video a thumbs up if you like what I'm doing here on my channel. Make sure you subscribe to me, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.